Hello everybody and welcome to another interstellar episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins eons ago with the shape-shifting alien race known as the Skrulls. As explained on the channel before, the Skrulls originally gained their powers when members of their race were experimented on by the space gods known as Celestials. This was similar to the experiments that the Celestials performed on Earth, which resulted in the creation of the Eternals and the Deviants. In the case of the Skrulls, the bodies of their respective deviants were permeated with unstable molecules, granting them the power to alter their shape and appearance at will. These Skrull deviants, also known as the Changing Ones, then exterminated the other non-changing Skrulls, conquering the planet Skrullos and proliferating until their entire species was a race of shapeshifters. However, in the midst of all this, another subspecies arose from the deviants. And turning their attention towards black magic as a means to gain power, this branch of Skrull kind diverged greatly from the others and became known as the Dire Wraiths. Outnumbered by the other Skrulls, these Dire Wraiths were driven from Skrullos and fled to an area of space called the Black Nebula, where they inhabited a new home planet, Wraithworld. Now, the environment there was incredibly hostile. The heat from volcanic eruptions counteracted the otherwise freezing temperatures, but also caused perpetual chemical storms that encircled the planet. Of course, the native animal species like the soul-eating Deathwings were equally dangerous. Nonetheless, the Dire Wraiths were content to live there in isolation, protecting themselves by drawing magical power from the Black Sun, and ultimately developing into their own distinct species. Having a natural affinity for this kind of sorcery, female Dire Wraiths are often referred to as Wraith Witches or Witch Wraiths. Males, however, were less proficient with magic, and although the Dire Wraiths had renounced the pursuit of scientific study, many of the dissatisfied males eventually sought to make use of science and technology instead of sorcery, and thus became known as Psi-Wraiths. Now, to be clear, all Dire Wraiths possess the capacity to practice dark magic, it's just that females are typically more adept. But anyway, roughly 200 years ago, it was the Psi-Wraiths who convinced the Wraith Queen Volks that they should invade and conquer the neighboring Golden Galaxy. And so with that, let's now turn our attention towards the planet Galador, heart world of the Golden Galaxy. During this time, the Galadorians were enjoying an era of prosperity and peace for their advanced civilization. They did have a large armada of spacecraft that charted the Golden Galaxy, and wherever they went, they brought technology and philosophy to share with those they encountered. But then one day, the Armada attempted to enter the Dark Nebula, just as the Dire Wraith fleet approached. Taken unawares, the Galadorian Armada was ambushed and annihilated by the Dire Wraiths, whose sorcerers unleashed a gigantic Deathwing. The Wraith fleet began making its way towards Galador, devastating a number of colonized and allied worlds on the way. Galadorian patrols soon sent word back to their home planet, and the news spread quickly among the people. Galador's leader, the Prime Director, recognized that what his world needed was noble warriors who could defend them. They needed knights. The call went out, and the Prime Director asked for volunteers willing to sacrifice their humanity and become something more for the greater good. The populace didn't know how to react to this request, and many averted their eyes, but then one man, a poet named Rom, raised his hand and stepped forward. True to his name, which in Galadorian meant before all others, Rom's courage inspired many to volunteer, and in the end, millions of Galadorians were willing to lay their lives on the line. They reported to the Hall of Science, and out of the many brave brave volunteers, roughly 1,000 were chosen to become Spaceknights. Rom was among those selected, much to the dismay of his lover, Reyna. She tried to talk him out of going through with it, and Rom admitted that he was terrified of what would happen, but was determined to do his part to defend Galador. Meanwhile, Rom also had a close friend named Karis, who volunteered and was among the chosen. Those two shared a particularly close bond because Karis had once saved Rom from drowning, and in Galadorian culture a life debt is considered a sacred responsibility. Eventually the day came for Rom and the other compatible volunteers to be surgically grafted into cyborg suits of armor made from nearly indestructible plandanium. The transformation was disorienting as flesh was replaced with living metal, but in the end Rom and his 1,000 comrades were converted into superhuman Spaceknights. Their removed biological components were preserved and placed into cryogenic storage with the promise that the volunteers could be returned to normal upon the defeat of the dire Wraiths. As Spaceknights, each possessed considerable strength, as well as the ability to fly through interstellar space. Rom's armor made him particularly strong, able to lift up to 15 tons. Many had more specific abilities, like Karis, who was granted command over Galador's living flame and took the name Firefall. Of the 1,000 or so first-generation Spaceknights, here are some of those whose names and abilities have been documented. There was Elandra, aka Starshine, who could fire searing beams of light from her eyes and teleport herself and others across interstellar distances. Darin was armed with a bolt-firing plandanium staff and became known as Javelin. Tarm and Skara were a brother and sister team that became Seeker and Scanner. Both were skilled trackers, with Seeker possessing more offensive capabilities, including explosive missile launchers hidden in his chest, as well as the ability to transform into a flying mode with electrified wings. Scanner, meanwhile, had more acute cyborg senses that could even predict near-future events, as well as the ability to generate a flux field that disrupted electronic devices. An arrogant Galadorian named Rak became Breaker and relished the forthcoming battles. Well suited for combat, he employed the power to fire devastating microwave blasts from his hands. Unam, the Unseen, lacked these kinds of offensive capabilities, but could use holographic technology and light bending to become completely invisible. Unam often harbored feelings of inadequacy, particularly around a woman named Vola, who he secretly had feelings for. Vola, however, was in a relationship with a man named Plor, and the two became the Spaceknights Trapper and Pulsar. Vola the Trapper could deploy prehensile nets that were capable of ensnaring even ethereal foes. If necessary, she could also channel energy through these nets to freeze, electrocute, or immolate her captured quarry. Meanwhile, her lover Pulsar could generate spherical force fields. In addition to forming defensive shields, he could use this ability to attack with pulsing waves of force. Gloriole was a highly respected philosopher before becoming a Space Knight that could fire powerful energy bolts. There was also Hammerhand, who, as the name implies, was armed with large, powerful fists, and Rainbow, who could project a spectrum of emotion-manipulating eye beams. Meanwhile, as the dire Wraiths approached Galador, one of the outworlds they attacked was the planet Thayri. Once a vibrant world filled with art and music, the citizens of Thayri were stricken with an incurable Wraith plague that spread across the entire population. By the time Galadorian scientists arrived, they found only a single survivor and brought him back to Galador. Careful not to let the infection spread, surgeons and scientists preserved his brain patterns and destroyed his diseased cells, grafting what little remained into a cyborg body. Armed with deadly black light eye beams, the resulting Space Knight became known as Terminator. Most of these Space Knights were also armed with weapons that were capable of banishing their foes to a timeless limbo dimension. For example, Terminator's I-beams and Vola's trapper nets were both able to do this. It should probably be noted that the limbo dimension in question is not the demonic realm associated with Magic and Madeline Pryor, but is at least connected in some way to the limbo where Immortus and the Space Phantoms reside. Rom in particular preferred this method of dealing with dire wraiths as he disliked the idea of killing. For this purpose, his weapon of choice was the Neutralizer, which he stored in a hyperspace pocket and could retrieve at a moment's notice. He could likewise call forth an energy analyzer to detect dire wraiths, as well as a universal translator that added newly deciphered languages to Rom's memory banks when used. But anyway, it was only days after wiping out the Galadorian armada that the dire wraiths reached Galador itself, and were met by a legion of Space Knights. Spurred on by the living flame, Firefall charged forward, kicking off the battle. The Space Knights held the line, preventing the Wraiths from reaching their home, but suffered a number of casualties in the process. The battle lasted for multiple days until the dire wraiths once more summoned their ultimate weapon, the all-consuming Deathwing. Dozens more Space Knights perished, but in the end the survivors rallied their might to drive the monster back, forcing the dire wraiths to retreat. Now, all the Space Knights I mentioned earlier were counted among these survivors, with one notable exception. Separated from his comrades during the battle, Karis Firefall was forced to face the dreaded Deathwing alone. While he did survive, he was left completely drained of energy, and the dire wraiths abducted him. And so, when the invaders fled, they took Firefall with them, leaving Rom to assume that his friend was gone. The remains of the fallen Galadorian Space Knights were collected and brought back to Galador so their families could mourn. Using an artifact called the Golden Globe, the Prime Director cremated the fallen Space Knights in solar fire. After that, the families of the survivors arrived with the hope that their loved ones could be restored. However, the Prime Director declared that while the battle was won, the war was far from over. Galador may have been safe for the moment, but the dire wraiths would march on the rest of the universe, and, if left unchecked, could eventually return stronger than ever. While Rom longed to reclaim his humanity and return to his beloved, Reyna was willing to wait for him until the fighting was truly over. Thus it was decided that the remaining Space Knights would strike out into the universe and cast their enemies into limbo until all were safe from the threat of the dire wraiths. Sure enough, the dire wraiths continued attacking Galador's outposts, colonies, and neighbors across the Golden Galaxy. To combat these threats, the Space Knights split into various squadrons. For example, one team included Skara the Scanner, Vola the Trapper, Tarm the Seeker, Plor the Pulsar, Rock the Breaker, and Unam the Unseen. Rom, meanwhile, had distinguished himself in the battle against the Wraith fleet and was heralded as the greatest of the Space Knights. He partnered with Starshine and Terminator, forming a powerful trio that scoured the stars for their enemy. Together, they shared many victories, like when they wiped out a dire Wraith war fleet in the Debarian satellite cluster. However, they also suffered a number of tragedies as many of their comrades fell in battle. Perhaps the most devastating loss for Rom came when he received a distress call from the farming world Agricon, where his beloved Reyna was living. Rom and his team rushed to the capital city there, only to find Reyna being held hostage by the dire wraiths. Not wishing him to sacrifice himself for her, Reyna broke free, but was shot down by the invaders. While Starshine and Terminator defeated her captors, Reyna died in Rom's arms, their promise to reunite after the war going unfulfilled. Now I will note here that in the midst of these adventures, Terminator proved himself to be more cold-blooded than his compatriots. At one point, he and his team came upon a Galadorian vessel that had been infected with the same Wraith plague that wiped out his homeworld. They found a group of survivors who'd been infected with the plague, but both Terminator and the infected knew that there was no cure. With the survivors preferring a quick death, Terminator destroyed the ship, killing them all instantly. Meanwhile, back on Galador, the Prime Director agonized over the sacrifices that his people had been forced to make. Hoping both to join them and to spare future Galadorians the same fate, he devised a new form of Space Knight armor, one that was animated not by living cells, but pure willpower. He created a prototype called Mentus, but when he tried to bring it to life, something went wrong and the would-be Space Knight was inhabited by a darker aspect of his personality. The director was apparently unaware of this, as Mentus secretly began plotting to conquer Galador for itself. Meanwhile, Rom's team tracked their enemy to the medieval planet Thuvria, where the king, Archon, was being manipulated by a Wraith disguised as his chief advisor. While this deception was revealed by Starshine's eye-beams, Terminator flew into a rage, slaughtering not just the Wraith, but the naive king who'd unwittingly harbored the enemy as well. Realizing what he'd done, Terminator surrendered himself to Rom and Starshine, who brought him back to Galador to stand trial before the Prime Director himself. Rom called for mercy given the horrors of war that Terminator had been forced to endure, as well as the fact that, unlike other Space Knights, it was impossible for him to regain his humanity. Terminator, however, made no attempt to defend himself, nor could he promise not to kill again. Nonetheless, the Prime Director was willing to give him a choice between banishment or death, to which Terminator chose the latter. He was seemingly consumed by the living fire, but at the last moment was teleported away and mentally enslaved by Mentus. Disheartened by Terminator's execution, Rom left Galador alone, suspecting that he would not return until the war was over. Elsewhere, another Space Knight, Gloriole, concocted a plan to study Wraith sorcery, which the Galadorians knew little about. Pretending to betray Galador, he allied with a group of dire Wraiths, but to prove his loyalty he was forced to lure Rom into a trap and help capture him. However, when the Wraiths announced their intentions to ship Rom back to the Dark Nebula, Gloriole regretted his actions and freed his ally. Upon this betrayal, the dire Wraiths fired on Gloriole, and his cyborg body was damaged beyond repair. After banishing those Wraiths to Limbo, Rom laid Gloriole to rest in a lone grave on a distant asteroid. Sometime after that, Rom took the fight to the enemy and pursued a Wraith command ship into the Dark Nebula. There, without backup, he invaded Wraithworld itself and banished countless dire Wraiths. In fact, this solo assault was so devastating he actually forced the survivors to abandon their homeworld. To cover the evacuation and keep the rampaging Space Knight occupied, Wraith witches placed a curse on Rom, forcing him to hallucinate an unending horde of Wraiths descending upon him while the survivors escaped. Meanwhile, following Rom's disappearance into the Dark Nebula, the Prime Director dispatched the Space Knight Squadron, consisting of Breaker, Scanner, Seeker, Pulsar, Trapper, and the Unseen, to retrieve him. They followed his trail to Wraithworld, and while the dire Wraiths had already evacuated, the Space Knights were forced to contend with monstrous elementals they'd left behind. They did ultimately find Rom, who was still under the influence of the Wraith Witch spell and perceived them as dire Wraiths, but in the end it was Unam the Unseen who succeeded in helping Rom see through the illusion. Thus, Unam, who often questioned his adequacy, was commended for his bravery by Rom, who was widely considered to be the greatest of the Space Knights. While the taking of Wraithworld could have marked the end of the war, Rom knew that the remaining dire Wraiths would infiltrate and threaten other societies, ones less capable of defending themselves. Thus he declared that their duty was not yet finished. As their campaign continued, eventually there came a point where all of Galador's Space Knights were off-world, and Mentus decided to seize this opportunity to make his move. He dispatched Terminator to the Hall of Science, where he fought his way past the Angel Elite. We haven't mentioned them yet, but at some point the Galadorians also genetically engineered a legion of winged warriors, presumably to maintain peace and order on Galador. Terminator was instructed to steal Rom's preserved biological components and to destroy those belonging to the other Spaceknights. However, even while being mentally controlled, he found himself unable to damn his comrades to the same fate that he had to suffer. Nonetheless, he did successfully return to Mentus with Rom's human remains. Using these, Mentus transformed Terminator into a cyborg, forging him into a mirror image of Rom. For the next part of his scheme, Mentus secretly took the Prime Director captive and faked his death. He then had a Terminator, posing as Rom, declare that the Wraith war was over, and use his reputation as a war hero to assume the position of a Prime Director. With his pawn serving as a figurehead, Mentus forged an alliance with the scattered Dire Wraiths and slowly began moving Galador and its surrounding systems towards the Dark Nebula. Over the following decades, Rom and the remaining Spaceknights hunted the Dire Wraiths across the universe. Striking out on his own, Unam the Unseen pursued a large contingent of Wraiths, following them to a primitive jungle world. There, he used his mastery of invisibility to quietly strike down individual Wraiths, causing them to believe that they were being attacked by an angry deity. Taking advantage of their fears, Unam purported himself to be a hidden god and enslaved the Wraiths of that world rather than eliminate them. Elsewhere, Rak the Breaker similarly betrayed his oath when he seized control of the Wraiths on planet Clavius. Except in his case, he took things a step further by using the Wraiths to subjugate the local population. A resistance soon formed to oppose him, joined by Breaker's former teammate Vola Trapper. In the midst of this, other Spaceknights slowly returned to Galador, but when they did, they were ambushed by Terminator, still posing as Rom, and frozen in suspended animation. Meanwhile, the Dire Wraiths continued to hide on other planets, and in the 1940s they used the global confusion born from the Second World War to infiltrate humanity. Sometime after establishing a foothold on Earth, the Wraiths brought Karis and his Firefall armor there to continue studying it. Realizing that after 200 years they were finally close to opening the armor, Karis turned his living flame inward, banishing his own consciousness to Limbo, where it could persist without a physical body. Rom eventually tracked the Dire Wraiths to Earth as well, specifically in West Virginia. He landed there to continue his crusade, and while this in many ways is where the story truly begins, I'm afraid it's also where our video for the week must end. So if you want to hear more about Rom's war against the Dire Wraiths, then be sure to let me know in the comments. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. And of course, I always need options to populate those polls with, so you can yell suggestions at me in the comments below for free. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!